So we are continuing Genesis, and today is going to be all about God. Okay, I know that it should be always all about God, but you'll see as we go through this what I mean by that. So last week, we were first introduced to Abraham, or Abram back then. I may say Abraham and Abram interchangeably. And Alex spoke on the call of Abraham. And God had called him to leave his home, this land that he was comfortable with, because God had a purpose for him. And that purpose lay beyond where Abraham was currently staying. And we looked at chapter 12, verse 1 through 3, and it says this: "Now the Lord said to Abram, 'Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed.'" And so God had this plan for Abram. And that plan was to make him a great nation so that the whole earth shall be blessed through him. But what we see, or what's really interesting, is that Abraham was not blessed just for himself. Right? It says right here, "I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great." And too often we think, okay, God bless me, make my name great. But God says, but it's so that you will be a blessing. And so the call was not that, Abraham, we want you to have all this great blessing, but Abraham, I'm going to use you so that blessing would spread to the whole world. And last week we looked at how the genealogy of Jesus was traced back, at least in Matthew, to Abraham. And so now what we understand this to be is the blessing wasn't riches. The blessing was really God coming down, getting involved in a people who had rebelled, getting involved in a people who fail time and time again to meet his standards, and saying, I'm going to get involved in the story and I'm going to restore relationship with you. And that's the blessing. Not riches, but relationship with God. And that's the call to Abraham. There's an article this week about this former military officer. Can we put up the picture, Gwen? Who graduated from the Graduate Institute of International Affairs and Strategic Studies at the ripe old age of 84. Okay, Mr. Wang. 84 years old, and he is still willing to go through school to do graduate level work. And at 84 years old, this guy graduated. Quite an accomplishment, right? And the reason I bring this up is we have to understand that when Abraham first gets the promise, he's 75 years old. 75 years old, and God says, I will make you a great nation. 75 years old with no children and a barren wife, and when he's 75 years old, God says, I'm going to give you a big family. Isn't that crazy? And then when we see Abraham here in Genesis chapter 15 in a moment, he's actually 85 years old. So he's older than this guy. And we think, wow, 84 and you graduate. That's such a great accomplishment. But think, if there is a promise that God has made you in your life, and you're 85 and childless, and part of that promise is to make you a great nation, to keep believing that, that's an accomplishment. We're nowhere in sight. God, where are these kids you promised? Where is this great nation that you're promising, right? 75 years old. So let's look at Genesis chapter 15, where Abram is now 85. It says this: "After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision, saying, 'Do not fear, Abram. I am a shield to you. Your reward shall be very great.' Verse 2, Abram said, 'O Lord, what will you give me, since I am childless, and the heir of my house is Eleazar of Damascus?' And Abram said, 'Since you have given no offspring to me, one born in my house is my heir.' Then behold, the word of the Lord came to him, saying, 'This man shall not be your heir, but one who will come forth from your own body, he shall be your heir.' And he took him outside." Just visualize this. He took him outside and said, "Now look towards the heaven and count the stars if you can count them." And he said to him, "So shall your descendants be." Now I know we live in the city and it is impossible to see stars. In fact, I have students that say they come back to Taipei and they realize that there's this thing called the horizon. that you can actually see when you're not in the city. You can actually look out and see where the land meets the sky. But if you actually leave Taipei and you go to a place with no pollution, so not Beijing, okay, you'll see lots and lots of stars, and God is showing Abraham this picture. Look at all those stars. You can't count these stars. It's like the grains of the sand in the beach. You can't count that. And Abraham says, I am going to multiply you so your family looks like this. Verse 6, and he believed the Lord, and he reckoned it to him as righteousness. 85 years old. Abraham, you're going to have this huge family. You can't even count how big your family is going to be. 85 years old, no child. And he believed the Lord. Verse 7, and he said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess it. He said, O Lord God, how may I know that I will possess it? So he said to him, bring me a 3-year-old heifer and a 3-year-old female goat and a 3-year-old ram and a turtle dove and a young pigeon. Then he brought all these to him and cut them in two and laid each half opposite the other. But he did not cut the birds. The birds of prey came down upon the carcasses, and Abram drove them away. Let's go back to verses 1 and 2, shall we? And I just want to re-emphasize something that Alex pointed out here. Look at verse 2. Abram said, O Lord God, what will you give me since I am childless? And the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. Do you sense that even though God made a promise, even though Abraham we would consider as a man of faith, do you sense the doubt? Right? There's a little bit of doubt in there, isn't there? It's like, God, I know you said this, but look, I'm 85 years old. I have no heir. And he starts to contemplate whether to give his inheritance to a servant, which was very, very common back in the days. So even in the midst of being a man of faith, I want you to see that there's doubt. And I want us to know that that is okay. That there is a struggle in his heart, but that doesn't mean he doesn't have faith. That true, genuine faith, realistic faith, is not going to be, I'm going to believe no matter what, I'm going to believe no matter. Genuine faith can actually take these doubts to God and say, God, help me. I know what you said, but yet there's doubts. That doesn't mean we lack faith, but in the midst of those doubts, we see that Abraham still what? Believed. Right? True faith is not necessarily faith that doesn't waver. Sometimes true faith is in the face of things that don't make sense. Like, I don't know how this is going to happen. I don't know how this is going to work, but God, I'm going to believe. Look what he says in verse 3. Abraham said, since you have given me no offspring. So who gave Abraham no offspring? Who's the you? God. Now, one way we could read this is we could read this as accusing. Like, God, what's up with that? You haven't given me any offspring. Another way to understand what Abraham is saying is, guess what? It depends on God. That it's not about what Abraham can do. It's not about how he can make it happen. That in the end, he is acknowledging what? Ultimately, it's not going to be me. Ultimately, God, it's you and your provision. That's faith. That even in the midst of things not working out, even though there's a promise and we're doubting, it's still knowing that it's not our job to make it happen, but ultimately, it's God. If it's God's will, as famous musician Bono said, it's God's bill. If it's God's will, it's up to him. Faith. I want us to look specifically at verse 6. I think the next 2 slides down. Then he believed the Lord, and he reckoned it to him as righteousness. He believed the Lord, so Abraham believed the Lord, and he, capital H, so who's the one that reckoned? God, reckoned it to Abraham as righteousness. Now this is really, it's a tricky reading. It's kind of tricky to unravel what's happening there, because if you just read it, here's what it seems like. It seems like Abraham had so much faith, and God saw that faith, and so God called him righteous. It's like, Abraham, you have so much faith, I have no choice but to declare you righteous. Another way to think about that is I have no choice but to acknowledge that the relationship with you is actually restored. But I want us to see, right? Abraham's righteousness is not because he conformed to some standard. Abraham's righteousness is simply because God decided to call him righteous. Do you see that? It's not that Abraham earned righteousness. It's that God credited him and said, Abraham, I see your faith. That doesn't meet a standard. That doesn't force me to call you righteous, but I'm still going to call you righteous. He didn't earn it. This is very important for us to understand. It's not like God saw Abraham's faith and he said, Abraham, you have earned righteousness. He didn't earn it. God credited it to him despite his imperfect faith. Did he deserve it? No. Did he earn it? No. God credited it. There's a story of a young child, and this young child loved nothing more than this toy boat. And he saved up all his allowance for weeks and weeks and weeks and months so he could buy this toy boat. And he loved this toy boat. And he would take it to the river, and he'd watch this toy boat go down the river. But one day, the toy boat got away from him. And it got washed away, and he couldn't reach it. He couldn't retrieve it. And this toy boat that he loved so much was gone. So he's walking around town one day, and he noticed in the window of a store was that toy boat that he loved so much. So someone had apparently found the boat, sold it to the secondhand store, and it's now displayed on this window. And he runs into the store, and he talks to the store owner, and he says, "That's my sailboat. That's my boat." And the store owner tells him, "Well, it's going to cost you this much." Little kid doesn't have that kind of money. So he says, "I don't have that. I can't get that much money for months, but that's my boat." So the store owner says, "How much do you have?" He digs in his pocket, pulls out whatever he had, not even clothes. But because the toy owner, or the store owner understood that he loved this boat, and because of the mercy of the store owner, even though he didn't deserve the boat, even though he couldn't pay for the boat, even though he rightfully couldn't afford the boat, still credited him the boat. And we need to understand that that is what is happening here. It's not like Abraham reached some sort of standard. It's not like Abraham was so faithful that God was impressed. "Wow, Abraham, you're so faithful. Therefore you're righteous." It's Abraham was faithful, but he still didn't deserve it. But God said, "I'm going to call you righteous." Romans chapter 3, verse 21 says this, "But now the righteousness of God has been manifested apart from the law, although the law and the prophets bear witness to it. The righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe, for there is no distinction." Verse 23, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and are justified by his grace as a gift through the redemption that is in Jesus Christ, whom God put forward as a propitiation by his blood to be received by faith." All have sinned. When God inspired Paul to write these words, these were not light words. These were not words that Paul was just like, this seems like it's going to complete my thought. When Paul says all, guess what? In the Greek, that means all. Every single person that Paul is addressing in the Roman church, they have all fallen short of God's standards. Every single person in this room, including me, have fallen short of God's standards. Every single person throughout history, including Abraham, Adam, Isaiah, King David, everyone but Jesus has fallen short of God's standards. Back when I worked at public school, I was poor. Not because this district didn't pay well, but because I had a lot of college loans. So my child would be going to University of Living Room instead of private school for sure. And this opportunity came up in the district that said, we really need teachers to train other teachers, and it pays well. She said, yes, I am an experienced veteran teacher of 3 years. I have much knowledge to impart to these teachers who are learning how to be teachers. And so what happened is, in the summer school program in my district, they would cram, I kid you not, 60 students in one classroom. 60. Where I work now, when we get up to 20 students, teachers start complaining. I just laugh. 60 students. Sometimes the air conditioning broke in summer. And how the program worked is they would have 3 teachers who have never been in the classroom, haven't actually even learned any teaching theory, not that that even really matters, and they throw them in under my guidance. And so I would give them a few pointers. I'd say, okay, I do this. I give them some advice, but I realized that you kind of have to learn on the job. It's kind of like you throw them in the pool, see if they sink or swim. And what I realized is I had such high standards for these new teachers who had no idea what they were doing. And I would get so upset if one of the 60 students was like not paying attention. I would get so upset if they didn't have meaningful contact with all 60-plus students in any given day. And I would feel like they didn't quite do their job if students weren't excited to learn. And I had such high standards. And when I took a step back, I realized I didn't even meet those standards. I realized that when I teach, guess what? People fall asleep. When I preach, people fall asleep, okay? I see you. When I teach, people fell asleep. They were not engaged. I did not inspire every single student. I did not have meaningful contact with every single student. So even though I had these high standards that were impossible for even the best teachers to reach, I myself did not reach them. Does God have high standards? Yes. Does God meet his own standards? Yes. Has God ever made a mistake? No. Right, so when we say, like, Abraham, it was credited to him as righteousness, don't make the mistake of thinking Abraham reached God's standards. He did not. Because Paul said, all have sinned. He didn't say everyone but Abraham, or everyone but Enoch, if you know that story or everyone but Elijah. He said every single person has sinned. Every single person has fallen short of God's standards. And we saw last week, Abraham himself lied that his wife was his sister. Do you think that meets God's standards? No. So Abraham himself did not meet God's standards. It's only because God saw that faith and said, even though you don't deserve it, I'm going to call you righteous. I'm going to make it seem like our relationship is in fact restored properly. Even though Abraham was not perfect, God saw that and said, I can work with that faith. Right? When we looked at Noah, everyone in the earth was just so evil, and it's not like Noah met God's standards because Noah was still a sinner, and we see that after. But God saw Noah and said, he doesn't deserve it, but I can work with that guy. I can use that guy. So here's all I want us to understand, okay? It's not that Abraham earned anything. He didn't earn righteousness. It's because God, in his mercy, called him righteous. To a Jewish person, this is actually pretty revolutionary, because to a Jewish person reading this later on, in their mindset, how did you get the promises of God? And how did you get blessed by God? You obeyed the what? The law. To a Jewish person, what they've seen all throughout their history is when we obeyed the law, we were blessed. And when we disobeyed God, we were not blessed, or that's what it seemed like. All of a sudden, reading the origins of who they are, they're saying, it's not about the law, because the law wasn't even given. Abraham was blessed, not because he had so much faith, but ultimately because God had the mercy to say, you didn't earn it, but I'm going to bless you. You didn't earn it, but I'm going to call you righteous. Right? We think this. I think this. I think if I just have enough faith, if I just obey God enough, God must bless me. But we know that's not true. We know ultimately it's because God is a God of love. God is a God who has mercy, that he calls us righteous. Are we there? It's too Calvinist for you? Okay. Now, it's going to get a little interesting. So, we're going to go on to verse 12. Okay? Let's before we go to verse 12, let's keep it up there though. What happened right before is Abraham took these animals and he cut them in half. Okay? What is going on? So Abraham takes these animals and he cuts them in half. Just keep that in mind. Here's what it says. Now, when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and behold, terror and great darkness fell upon him. Oftentimes, when we see that word terror, that is man's response to the presence of God. When God comes, there's just this fear, this holy fear that comes. Okay? Verse 13, and God said to Abram, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, where they will be enslaved and oppressed for 400 years. So obviously God is talking about Egypt. But I will also judge the nation whom they will serve, and afterward they will come out with many possessions. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You will be buried at a good old age. Then in the 4th generation they will return here, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. Okay? You can listen to the Joshua series if you're wondering what that's about. Okay, next. Next. It came about when the sun had set that it was very dark. Okay, that's obvious. And behold, there appeared a smoking oven. Okay, picture this. A smoking oven and a flaming torch which passed between these pieces. On that day, the Lord made a what? Covenant. Say it again. Covenant with Abram, saying, to your descendants I've given this land from the river of Egypt as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, and then he goes on and he goes on. Okay, very strange scene. So let's understand what is happening here. Okay? A covenant back then, and still is actually, is a binding lifetime agreement between two people. So it's not an agreement that happens just for this period of time. It is binding, and it is a lifetime agreement. Okay? Furthermore, what's kind of different about how we understand promises and contracts and how a Jewish mind would understand covenant is it is unconditional. In other words, it doesn't matter whether the other person meets their part of the bargain. You, as a person who has made a covenant, must fulfill your part regardless of whether the other person fulfills their part. Are you with me? Okay? Oftentimes, these covenants were made between equals, but other times they were made between like a king and his servants. So there's a little bit of debate about what model this follows. If you're interested, it also talks about covenants in Jeremiah. Okay, and you can look that up if you're there. Okay, so what they were doing here was they were making a covenant. God was making a covenant, a binding agreement with Abram. Now, the terminology that was used back then is they cut a covenant. They don't just make a covenant, they cut a covenant. Because remember what happened, right? There is this cow. Picture this as a cow. And Abram literally cuts the cow in half and then separates the two halves. And what they did back then is they walked between the two halves of these animals that they had just cut. I know, very gruesome, right? But what they're basically saying is, if I break covenant, if I don't fulfill my promise, then may what happened to this animal also happen to me. That's very serious. Because what you're basically doing is you're proclaiming a curse on yourself. It's saying, if I don't meet the requirements of this agreement, then may what happened to this animal happen to me as well. You're cursing yourself. Now, nowadays, if you break contract, a lot of bad things can happen. All right? There's teachers that break contract all the time, and the school could sue you, or you just don't get what was promised to you in other parts of the contract. So we think if I break contract, no big deal. Back then, if you break contract, if you break covenant, it's a huge deal. Because you're proclaiming a curse upon yourself and generations after you. That's huge. But I want you to notice what happens. Who walks through the halves? An oven and a torch. Does Abraham walk through the halves? What was he doing? Sleeping. Who walks through the halves? An oven and a torch. A smoking oven and a flaming torch. A Jewish person reading that automatically would think about the pillar of fire and the cloud. Whenever you see images like this, a flaming torch and a smoking oven, it would think, when we were walking out of Egypt, there was cloud like smoke, and there was fire at night. So symbolically, whenever you see this, it is symbolizing the presence of God. So who walks through the covenant? God. Isn't that amazing? Abraham does not. God himself is the only one who walks through the covenant. Why? Because all have fallen short of the glory of God. Because God knows this simple truth. You will mess up. You will fail to live up to the agreement of the covenant. You will mess up. I will mess up. The person next to you will mess up. Everybody you know will mess up. So God is saying, I understand that if you walk through this covenant, you're not going to be able to fulfill it. You're not going to be able to do your part of the bargain. So guess what? I'm going to walk through the covenant, and I'm going to be torn in half. And I'm going to shed blood for your mistake. Right? God's saying, you will not be able to meet the requirements. Your righteousness, Paul calls it filthy rags. I'm not even going to get into what that is. But our righteousness before God, even our best behavior, is filthy rags. And so God knows my standards are here. And if you walk through this covenant with me, you're going to fail. And so I will walk. So I will stand in your place. So I will be torn for you. We do have a part. Okay, and we'll talk about this next week. We do have a part. But God understands. Adam failed, Noah failed, Abraham failed, David failed. On and on down the line, except for one, Jesus did not fail. We will fail. So ultimately, God's saying, the covenant is not based on you. You can't do anything to fulfill this. The covenant is based on me and my ability and my love for you to fulfill this. Just because we fail doesn't mean God removes his promises. That's very immature thinking. Just because we mess up doesn't mean that that promise of salvation is gone. Don't get me wrong. There are conditional promises in the Bible, which we'll talk about in 2 weeks. So you have to come, otherwise your theology is all messed up, okay? But in terms of salvation, in terms of restoring relationship, God did it, and your mistakes can't erase that. So I said earlier, this message is going to be about God. And all I wanted us to see is, man, Abraham wasn't righteous because he had so much faith. Ultimately, God called him righteous. And ultimately, it's God that fulfills the promise. It's not up to Abraham to earn the promise, to make it happen. Ultimately, God said it. God's going to fulfill it. But in terms of just personal application, because it's kind of weird if you just walk out of here and go, wow, God is great. I mean, that's ultimately what we want. right? That we understand the greatness of God and we respond to that. But if God takes care of all of this, why don't we trust him in smaller areas? Do you know what I mean? Like, God took care of the biggest problem, which was we couldn't live up to his standards. We couldn't make the blessing happen. We couldn't restore relationship. We're filthy. If God can take care of that big problem, why don't we trust him with the little problems? Why don't we trust him in the little things? Why don't we trust that the promises that he gives in his word will come true, even though we don't see it, even though we feel like, I'm 85 years old, God. This doesn't seem to be happening. Because what I hope we see is when we fail, God does not fail. When we are unfaithful, God will be faithful. When we run away from God, God runs after us. There's a great picture of this in the book of Hosea. Of this God that even though he knows his people will mess up, not yet, Gwen, not again, okay? Even though his people mess up, he fulfills his end. Even though his people run away, he fulfills his end. Even though his people fail time and time again, he fulfills his part. And the book of Hosea, if you don't know, is God calls this prophet Hosea to marry a prostitute. And do you think that prostitute is going to be faithful? No. So I'm going to show you a clip by a guy named Judah Smith. Anyone heard of Judah Smith? He's kind of there's this upcoming group of pastors lately in the U.S., kind of a new wave of pastors, so to say. And he just says it a lot better than I could ever say it. Now, this could be good or bad, but he is Justin Bieber's pastor. Okay, don't hold that against him. But he will clearly explain
Hosea chapter 3, verse 1. Then the Lord said to me, go again, Hosea. What? Go find her. Love this woman who's loved by a lover and is right now committing adultery. Go find her, Hosea. Go find her. Look what's after the comma. Just like the love of the Lord for Israel. I love her. Now, where it says Israel, it means Israel, but it also prophetically speaks of God's love for the whole world. Go find her again. This is like my love for the children of Israel who look to other gods and love the raisin cakes of the pagans. In other words, they like the things that society, stuff, possessions that the world offers. They're trying to find love and meaning and purpose in that. Go find her. Boy, that must have been a heart-wrenching process. As you go looking for your wife who was a former prostitute, who's now back into prostitution, where do you go looking for her, friends? How messy is that search? How painful is that pursuit? As he walks the streets, everyone says you don't go to those neighborhoods. Men of God should never be seen in those places and buildings. But here's Hosea looking for who? His wife, of all people. Going on in verse 2, he continues to write, so I bought her. I bought her for myself for 15 shekels of silver and 1 1/2 homers of barley. Wait. She's your wife, Hosea. She's already yours. What was the scene like? as Gomer's back in the sex slave industry. What are the chances? Does Gomer find her on some pedestal somewhere, chained and shackled, naked, being sold to the highest bidder? Hosea there sees his wife, the mother of their 3 children, and Hosea looks at her and says, "Excuse me, sir, that's my wife." He goes, "Sir, I don't care who you think she is. This is her price." But what's the price? And he pays for what is already his. The Bible says, I hope you understand, Hosea is a picture of God, and no offense, you and I are a picture of Gomer. The Bible says the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. Mankind is the unique possession of the Creator God. And yet, 2,000 years ago, he paid a dear price. He paid for what he already possessed. And he sent his son, who spilled his blood, to purchase back what he already owned. How much? Hosea gets the money. What was that exchange like when Hosea looked in the eyes of his wife? No doubt she hung her head in embarrassment. He's found me. I've abandoned him, I've abandoned our 3 kids. And yet he insists on buying me. These other men sought to buy her, to use her. Hosea seeks to buy her, to heal her. It says in verse 4, "For the children of Israel shall abide." Now this is where Hosea shifts in, and he starts speaking prophetically. This is really no longer about him and Gomer. It's about something that is to come. It's about something bigger. Verse 5, afterward, there's going to come a season. He didn't know it would be 750 years, but it would. There'd be no king. It would be difficult. It would be unclear. It would be challenging. But then the children of Israel shall return and seek the Lord their God and David their king. And then notice what it says. They shall fear the Lord. Now, Israel and Judah knew what it was to fear the Lord. And by fear, I mean terror. Under the old system of relating to God, there was terror. Terror, because God, they were unable to keep his commands, the 10 commandments, and there was judgment and there was wrath. But there will come a day, he prophesies. There will come a Messiah, and he will finally satisfy and appease the wrath of God. And the fear of the Lord in those days will be in awe of his goodness in the latter days. The fear of the people will not be of terror. It will be in awe of his graciousness towards humanity. Hosea just bought Gomer, even though she was already his. This is the picture of the gospel. Salvation completes the work in spite of her sins, in spite of her doings, in spite of running away. And then he stands and says, and there will come a day, a King David will rise. And in those days they will fear his goodness. These are the days that we live in. Our Hosea has come. Salvation has come. And he found you, and he found me, and he had to walk to the most despicable places, and he had to communicate and be around sinful, broken humanity. Don't you see? As Hosea searched for his wife, so Jesus came searching for the salvation of humanity. And by the way, when God found you, you were not so neat and nice and put together. You were in chains, and you were naked, and you were sinful, and so was I. And our gracious God said, how much? How much? The blood of your Son. For then and only then can they, humanity, avert the wrath and justice that is rightfully on their heads. Very well. Very well. I'll send my son.